Thank you so much for joining us. Good afternoon. Nice to see so many faces, familiar faces here for the annual Andrew H. Siegal Lecture. My name is Jonathan Lincoln. For those who don't know me, the director at the Center for Jewish Civilization at the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. And it's really my great pleasure to introduce our lecturer today, Dr. Chuck Freilich, who is this year's Andrew H. Siegal Visiting Professor in American Middle Eastern Foreign Policy. The annual professorship and lectureship is made possible by the support of Mr. Michael Deutsch, an alumni of the college and the law school, and partner and co-founder of Singer Deutsch LLP, and of course his family. Unfortunately, Mike is unable to be with us today. He's normally with us at these lectures, but we acknowledge his and his family's critical support and continuing support for the CJC and the School of Foreign Service. So please do silence phones. The professorship was inaugurated in honor of the late Andrew Siegal, a philanthropist who lived in both the United States and Israel, and is inspired by Siegal's hopeful vision for the Middle East. We're going to shortly, in the coming days, be announcing next year's Siegal Professor. So please do stay tuned for that. I'm sure you'll agree, for those who know Chuck, that we have an incredibly accomplished and really entirely appropriate speaker to enlighten us on the topic of the U.S.-Israel strategic relationship, certainly at such a pivotal and concerning moment, given the ongoing U.S.-Israel war in Iran and its many broad implications throughout the region. Of course, Dr. Freilich served for over 20 years in Israel's national security establishment as a senior analyst and deputy national security advisor in the Prime Minister's office. After leaving government, he was a longtime senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. He's taught political science at Harvard College. He continues to teach political science at Tel Aviv University, Columbia, at NYU, and of course, here at Georgetown, where he's been a great addition to the academic year. He's the author of a number of books, including Zion's Dilemmas, How Israel Makes National Security Policy, published by Cornell University Press in 2012, Israeli National Security, A New Strategy for an Era of Change by Oxford University Press from 2018, and Israel and the Cyber Threat, How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power from Oxford University Press in 2023. He's currently working on a new book, which I'm sure he'll talk about this particular topic. He's also published numerous academic articles, hundreds of op-eds, appears frequently in Israeli international media. I'm sure many of you have seen Dr. Freilich's recent piece in Haaretz following the outbreak of the war. Highly recommend you take a look at that. And I'd like to now invite Dr. Freilich to the podium to deliver this year's Siegal Lecture, after which we will, of course, have time for Q&A from the audience. And hopefully you'll join us for a small reception afterwards. And just to remind everyone of Georgetown's speech and expression policy, there will be plenty of time for discussion and hopefully active discussion in the appropriate way, as we do here at Georgetown, following the lecture. So, Chuck, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. It is a true pleasure to be here. Let me, first of all, thank Jonathan for the invitation to be the Siegal Fellow this year, and to Michael Deutsch, who has helped make this possible, Marissa for her help throughout the year, and Sammy for helping make my coursework last semester. I must say, teaching at Georgetown was actually one of the best experiences I've had, and as Jonathan was saying, I've taught in various universities, and I don't think I enjoyed teaching anywhere as much as I did here, and I mean that I'm not just buttering you up so that you'll be more sympathetic during the rest of the conversation. There is one thing that I must say at the outset, which is fundamentally wrong, and that is the Israeli in the crowd is wearing a tie in the American way. And one of us is making a big mistake, and I think I know who it is. It's myself. But okay. Jonathan mentioned that I'm writing a new book on the U.S.-Israeli military and strategic relationship. Started looking on this a couple of years ago, but I finished the research, started writing a few weeks ago. And the truth is, for the last 2 years, certainly since the war in Gaza broke out, new chapters are being written for me on an almost daily basis, and it's actually quite fascinating what's happening. If you look at the development of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, the so-called special relationship, in the early decades, give or take 40 years, there's been around 78, give or take the first 4 decades, the congruence between the normative values between the two countries and the overall political objectives is at its height. Strategic cooperation is non-existent. For the first 2 decades, there's no military relationship. That only begins in the late 60s. But normative agreement at its height, no strategic relationship. The last 40 years, there's been growing disagreement in terms of our shared policy objectives and at the normative level. And at the same time, the strategic relationship, which starts in the 80s, really from the 90s, and takes off after the 2000s, and reaches new heights post the Abraham Accords and Israel's inclusion in CENTCOM, the Central Command. And we've reached really remarkable heights where Israel is fighting alongside the U.S. today, the second joint war in less than a year, and this time it's a real war. June was a big operation. This is already, I think, qualified as a war. Israel is bringing to bear capabilities. Listen carefully to what I'm saying, because this is a remarkable fact. With the exception of South Korea, no American ally, none of the NATO allies, not Japan, New Zealand, Australia, none of them are capable of bringing to bear the kind of conventional military capabilities, at least on the air and ground, that Israel has today. Israel has more tanks, more aircraft, more personnel, military manpower overall than any American ally except for South Korea. In the naval area, some of the other allies have greater fleets than Israel does, but even so, in some areas, not by orders of magnitude. Since the war, and I'll speak of the Gaza war in June and now as being one really ongoing war. Since the war began, October 7th, I think we've seen the relationship both at its best, and in some ways we've also seen the fault lines exposed as never before. Biden demonstrated remarkable support for Israel, deploys 2 aircraft carrier groups and further military assets 4 times in the course of the year and a half that the war is going on while he's president. Vetoes resolutions in the Security Council, broad diplomatic support, and yes, at a certain point, somewhere around mid-2024, there is growing disagreement about the war's objectives, about the level of casualties, but still overriding support until the very end of his presidency. Trump, the first 6 months, there was zero daylight on Gaza, and then there's the June war. The first time that there's ever a joint war or mini war. I should have said that under Biden, we had the first ever joint defensive operations twice in 2024, in April and in October, when the Iranians launched their missile barrages at Israel, and the first very limited joint offensive operations against the Houthis. But the first operation that maybe qualifies as being a mini war, certainly a substantial operation, offensive one, is June. Under Trump. And of course, now we're in a larger scale war. But Trump too starts becoming frustrated with what he considers to be these intransigent stonewalling, whatever you want to call it, in Gaza. And by the fall, imposes a ceasefire, forces Bibi to accept the 20-point peace plan, which, by the way, isn't actually a pretty good plan from Israel's point of view. The chances that stage 2, which we're supposedly in now, calls first and foremost for the dismantlement of Hamas as a militarily, disarming it, and secondly, toppling it as the governing body of in Gaza. And I think the likelihood of that happening anytime in the foreseeable future is about as likely as the Mashiach, the Messiah, coming anytime soon. But at least under Jewish belief, but we'll see when that happens. But he forces Bibi to accept that. The plan has not gone forward really in any substantive way in recent months. And so Trump, since he needed some success, decides to set up the overall framework, the political framework. If he can't get the substance, if he can't do anything really about Hamas, then he does set up the Board of Peace, which is the overall governing body, and then an executive body, and a technical Palestinian government for day-to-day administration of what's happening in Gaza. And I don't want to discount that because, first of all, every little bit helps. And maybe once the framework is in place, maybe down the line, there will be the possibility of substantive progress. He also forced Bibi to accept that Qatar and Turkey, which Israel views as fundamentally hostile, basically enemy states, he forced Bibi to accept them as part of the Board of Peace as well. The war also exposed Israel's extreme dependence on the United States. Not that people in Israel didn't recognize beforehand that there was very significant dependence, but I think many people in Israel deluded themselves as to the extent of it. And it turned out that it was even far greater than those of us who have long talked about it believed, because it turned out part of the colossal fiasco of October 7th was that it turned out that Israel needs American support, not just for Iran, that we always, but for limited threats such as Hamas and Hezbollah. Even Hamas was the weakest of our enemies, we thought. And it turned out that Israel needs American support even for that, major support. No country likes to be dependent on an outside power, even if it's a rather benevolent one. And that's true, of course, for Israel as well. I've always believed that the relationship between the US and Israel is absolutely existential for the state of Israel. Somehow, things will work out with the Iranians, one way or the other. They will bomb their nuclear capabilities into will obliterate them truly, the rocket capability. Somehow we'll work things out with Hamas and Hezbollah, and God willing, sometime maybe around the year 3000 with the Palestinians as well. But we need the US for all of that. And so the one thing that really keeps me up at night is the future of the relationship, where it's heading, and I will come back to that in a minute. But what are the sources of Israel's dependence on the US? Well, most people, if you say, what makes Israel so dependent on the US? Well, they'll say it's the military aid, $3.8 billion a year. That's a lot of aid. And it is certainly very important for Israel. But it turns out $3.8 billion is less than 1% of Israel's GDP. It's less than 3% of the national budget. Now, get an Israeli minister to cut his or her budget by 3%, and you really have a war in your hands. But the truth is, it can be done. The 3.8 billion is 22% of the defense, around 20% of the defense budget. But the defense budget would take a catastrophic cut were American aid to end. But really what that would mean is that Israel would have to do a reordering of national priorities, and that can be done. Where the aid is really critical is in a whole variety of other areas. It's strategic cooperation. For decades, joint strategic consultations on all of the major threats that the two sides faced in the Middle East, whether it was Iran and Iraq and Hezbollah and Hamas, and in the past Libya and others. The fact that Israel, a small regional power, can hold these consultations with the global superpower was of great importance and joint planning as a result of it. And there is vast intel and cyber cooperation and counterterrorism cooperation between the two countries. And Israel punches way above its weight in these areas. It's a leading American partner in these areas, way up there with the top allies. There's joint development of weapon systems, bilateral and multilateral exercises, military exercise, pre-positioning of American weaponry in Israel. It's American weaponry, but which Israel has access to as well. And I think most people presume that there is a de facto, no de jure, but there is a de facto American security guarantee for Israel's existence. There's what I would call strategic diplomatic cooperation. I'm not talking about just the day-to-day relationship, but the fact that the U.S. regularly vetoes anti-Israeli resolutions in the Security Council. And had it not been for the U.S. veto, Israel would have been the subject of sanctions many years ago. There's American efforts to help Israel integrate into the region, normalization, develop relations with countries around the world. The Abraham Accords, the fact that the U.S. is the only country which is not in every area, but largely supported Israel's positions in the various negotiations that have taken place over the decades with the different parties. At the same time, I think there is great underappreciation of just how much Israel reciprocates. The American narrative is we provide aid, endless aid, and Israel not only maybe doesn't reciprocate, but sometimes even sounds ungrateful. I think that that's not the case. So as I was saying before, in intel and cyber and counterterrorism and a whole variety of other areas, Israel is a leading partner. Israel has developed and deployed military capabilities in its own defense, but far greater than any other American ally, just about, except for South Korea. They're also supposed to be acting in behalf of their own self-defense. They have not stepped up to the plate, whether financially or operationally. Israel has. Israel devotes a far larger percentage of its resources than other countries do. And during the Cold War, the Europeans were under a potentially existential threat. They didn't quite step up the way Israel has. Since the Ukraine war broke out, they haven't quite stepped up the way Israel has. So, of course, what Israel is doing is out of self-interest, but that's true of all alliance relationships. I said before that the degree of dependence is extreme, to the point that there's a painful question that I have to ask. It's painful after 78 years of Israeli independence. Can Israel even survive today without the United States? I've posed that question. I wrote about it in my previous book, and it's a question that I'll come back to in greater detail in the current book, the new one, but I posed it in various forums in Israel, the National Security Council, the IDF, and Mossad, and other places, and I expected everybody to fall out of their chairs. I said, what do you mean, how can we survive without the U.S.? And well, what I got was a yawn. Because everybody recognizes that it's critical. Maybe Israel could survive. I mean, I don't know, it's hypothetical, and in extreme circumstances, people come up with extreme solutions, but it is certainly an infinitely weaker, less secure existence. It's a less prosperous existence. It's an existence that no one in Israel left to right wants to go back to. It's going back decades in Israeli history. And in practical terms, the answer may actually be no. It's the very fact that I can even raise the question, and people aren't horrified, that is of such importance. Well, where is the relationship heading? And I don't think anywhere good. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is a collapse in support for Israel in the American public, to the point that the collapse on the Democratic side is already a couple of years old. And now we're seeing some decrease on the Republican side, and overall public opinion is now more favorable to the Palestinians than to Israel. That was always the opposite and opposite to the extreme. I was deeply concerned about where the relationship was heading long before the war broke out. I thought we were heading for a crisis. I think the war postponed it for a while, but amplified it considerably. Generations of Americans have grown up now on a narrative of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is largely incorrect. Not all of it. Some of it is legit, but it is largely incorrect about a brutal racist occupying apartheid Israel. And in the last couple of years, there's the accusation of genocide. A lot of people have died in Gaza. One can make the case maybe too many, but one thing it is not is genocide. By any, I think, real definition of genocide. Genocide is the Holocaust. Genocide is Pol Pot in Cambodia. Genocide is Rwanda. This is a war which may have caused too many casualties. The difference between that and genocide is just day and light. But that's the narrative. It's not the narrative that earlier generations grew up on of a heroic Israel fighting its enemies for survival, refugees fleeing religious persecution from Europe, Holocaust survivors, a pioneering society, leading democratic party. Part of this is a change in demography on both sides. First and foremost, if you look at the two most rapid, what am I getting here, which is causing, I want to keep causing it going.
Probably just the wires on the bottom. So
I will try not to do that. The two most rapidly growing groups in the United States, population groups today, are the religiously unidentified, and we know that there's actually a high correlation between religiosity and support for Israel. And the second group is the Hispanic population, and it's not that Hispanics have anything against Israel, they just don't have anything particularly with it. And we've seen Jewish support become more conditional. I'll come back to that in a minute. Weakens overall support for Israel. And in Israel, we have the ultra-Orthodox who couldn't care less, and the far right, the Smotriches, the Ben-Gurions, who really couldn't care about the relationship with the U.S. Most of the Israeli public recognizes, give or take, how important it is. But that fringe does not and doesn't care. Part of the reason is that there really are differences today between Israel and the American Jewish community, which at a time when Israel is moving to the right, the American Jewish community is a left-wing community, center-left, left-wing community, maybe moving further to the left. The collapse of the peace talks in 2000, Arafat's rejection of the Camp David proposals, the Clinton parameters, and then of the 2008 proposal by Omer. These were incredible proposals which would have given the Palestinians a state on essentially 100% of the West Bank and Gaza 20 years ago. Speak louder.
if you could speak louder. Yes.
It would be easier if I could turn up the volume. I'm not good at speaking loud. I will try. Okay, sir, maybe you want to move up a little bit closer because
Try.
I would find that. So the collapse of the peace process in the face of what were really dramatic Israeli proposals. No Israeli government, probably forever, will be able to put similarly forward-coming proposals in the future. Just Israel put every concession that it possibly could on the table at the time, and the Palestinians rejected it. 3 occasions. The fact that they then launched the second Intifada, which cost 1,100 Israeli lives at a time when the Jewish population was maybe 5 million. The war of the last 2.5 years, which is a war of survival. from Israel's perspective. Most people in the US and around the world don't realize Israel is still living October 7th. The rest of the world has moved on and are focused on what's happened since then and what's happened in Gaza and happening now. Israel is still in the midst of October 7th. If you watch TV, and people still watch TV in Israel, and they watch TV news, and the three different channels, the over-the-air channels, all have endless talk shows and news-based shows, hours every day. Most of it is still about October 7th, about what happened, the catastrophe, about people who were killed, about the hostages who were taken, who were then released, their stories. Not about what happened subsequently in Gaza. And then, of course, we had the war with Hezbollah, and we had the first round with Iran, and now we have this round with Iran. People around the world are focused on the Palestinian issue. The American Jewish community is focused not only, but largely on the Palestinian issue, and of course influenced by the broader American political discourse on the issue. I believe that the American Jewish community is too far removed from Israel's reality, it simply does not understand it. And here's something that the Jewish community in the States can do. But Israel, in response to these developments, is moving to the right. The entire political spectrum has moved to the right. If you look at the most far left party today, headed by Yair Lapid, the Democrat Party, he talks about a two-state solution in theory, but he doesn't believe there's any chance of it happening for the foreseeable future. And no one to the right of him thinks that there's any prospects of it happening. But the whole world is talking about a two-state solution. It's become an international law. I would submit to you, we can get into this in the Q&A. I don't know that I don't have time for this now. But I think the two-state solution is probably dead, was probably dead long before the war began. The classic two-state solution. And we have to start looking at alternative paradigms for how to go forward, because the fact that that paradigm may no longer work doesn't mean that we don't need some paradigm. We do, at least as much as we did at the time. Another reason that there's a difference between Israel and the Jewish community is support or lack thereof for President Trump, who is, let's say, widely disliked in the liberal community in general in the United States. And in Israel, he is extremely popular. And people in the US say, well, how could that be? And the answer is, well, remember, all politics are local, as the old saying goes. And Israelis say, well, has Trump been good for us? And the answer is, yeah, it's been very good for Israel. He, in the first term, recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel, Jerusalem as Israel's capital, something that previous presidents had not done for decades, even though there's congressional legislation about Jerusalem, ever since 1995. Everyone in the world knows that Jerusalem is Israel's capital and that the Golan Heights are not going back to Syria. Not going to happen. Trump finally came up and said it. And the Abraham Accords was his achievement. Like him or not, he gets credit for that. And moving Israel from EUCOM, the European Command, to the Central Command, the Middle East Command, was something that was long overdue, and it was the basis then for all the strategic cooperation since then. Then we had the 12-day war last June, and now with this war. Israel's been preparing for this war with Iran for decades, and believe that it has to happen. The time will come. Always hope that the U.S. would be involved. Previous presidents were not willing to do it. Trump was. Part of the problem, of course, is that Bibi intentionally played on partisanship, leveraged partisanship for his own political purposes, especially the infamous speech to Congress back in 2015, I believe it was. And again, let me say again something for the Jewish members of the audience as a message generally. I have a real problem with people in the Jewish community who express disaffection, alienation, disengagement for Israel. Criticism, fun. Anybody who reads what I've written over the decades, Jonathan said I've written a few hundred op-eds at this point, and nobody can shut me up. I'm an opinionated SOB. I I have no problem with people criticizing. We have the phenomenal fortune, both in the US and Israel, living in democracy. But 78 years after Israel's rebirth, 81 years after the Holocaust, 2,000 years after, it took us 2,000 years to reestablish our national sovereignty. If you're alienated from Israel, not from the politics of the Israeli government, that's fine. I'm as alienated as you can be. But if you can't continue to support Israel, the state of Israel, and I have an impolite suggestion for people, those people can do. So let me conclude with one or two final questions. Yeah, one last one. If Israel is so dependent on the US, what should it do to preserve this relationship for the long term? Because all the trends look bad at the moment. Well, I think the number one most important thing that Israel could possibly do is either reach some sort of peace agreement with the Palestinians, or at least change the American narrative that has taken food in the last 20 years until somewhere around 2000, give or take a year or so, a few years. The American discourse held that Israel's side continually pursuing peace, the Palestinians are the obstacle. Since then, the discourse has changed. So either change the reality by reaching a peace agreement, or at least change the discourse. And we're going to have to reach a new basis for the military and strategic relationship. It's been 50 years now that Israel has been the beneficiary of growing and large-scale American military assistance. It's the financial, I'm talking about the financial side. Currently, $3.8 billion. It has to come to an end at some point. Okay? Nothing continues forever. Bibi came away from his last meeting with Trump a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, and announced a 10-year phase out to begin at the end of the current 10-year package ends in 2028, and a 10-year phase out thereafter. I imagine what he heard from the president is we're not going to renew another 10-year package, so prepare for it. And I think Bibi was right to come along and preempt any public announcement by taking initiative himself and saying, okay, 10-year phase out. I think he jumped the gun a little bit. First of all, I'm not convinced it had to be 10 years. Maybe it could have been a little bit longer than that. Had it not been for the war of the last couple of years, I would have said that 10 years is fine. Israel's going to be in a deep, deep, deep financial hole for the next few years because of the war's expensive. Maybe it was 13 years, 15 years. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is that there are all sorts of really interesting proposals out there. Again, well, if you want in the Q&A, I'll come to that. For how to now put the basis on a reciprocal, the relationship on a reciprocal basis, so that the two sides are contributing maybe even equally to a joint fund each year, a joint budget, joint R&D for joint operations, for all sorts of things. A third possibility is an idea that's been around for decades. I don't fully know what the ramifications would be. I'm working on that now. Maybe the aid budget should be transferred to DOD. Then it's not a standalone budget under the State Department where it stands out as a sore thumb, $3.8 billion. It's the biggest foreign aid budget. If it's part of the Pentagon, it's just like the U.S. spends billions a year defending Germany and the UK and all the NATO allies and Japan and Australia and New Zealand, etc. That might ease the problem, the public image. And another possibility is, okay, maybe if we're going to phase out the aid, maybe part of the deal would be a defense fee. And the last point, I think, Israel should formally define, most people agree with this, but at least formally define a pivotal part of Israel's national security strategy should be preserving the relationship with the U.S. And that means, to the extent possible, aligning Israel's policies with those of the U.S. as often and to the extent that is humanly possible. It'll never be 100%. It isn't with any ally. And it's certainly not going to be with an ally which is the size of New York City in population and a global colossus. But that should be there as a guiding light for Israeli policymakers at all times. Thank you. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll take the prerogative of maybe asking the first question and then opening it up to the audience. But you mentioned the long time brewing crisis, if you will, in the U.S.-Israel relationship, and you talked about the ongoing war right now as exacerbating the situation. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit for us, and maybe I could help or maybe distract you by asking maybe a little bit of a ridiculous sort of crystal ball question. But what do you see as the worst case scenario coming out of this war, and then maybe what the best case scenario is? Thank you.
So first of all, I'm glad that my great TA last semester is here. She usually arrives on time. Good to see you. First of all, Jonathan, for the second part of your question, I must say, I've been in this business for a while. I can dodge anyone.
Okay.
I won't. As I said before, there are generations of Americans who've grown up on a totally different narrative of what Israel is. Its role in the region, its involvement in the peace process, etc. It's really the Palestinian issue, because in other areas, the differences weren't that. The substantive policy differences have never been that great. Yes, the Democratic side was very angry about what Bibi did coming to the Congress at the time, and clearly playing partisanship here. But that's the type of thing that people could have gotten over with time. The one issue which I think has been totally corrosive has been the differences over the Palestinian issue, first and foremost settlements, because nobody in the world understands what Israel is doing. It seems to be totally counterproductive just from an Israeli perspective. If you want to remain a predominantly Jewish, not 100%, but predominantly Jewish and democratic state, why would you be doing things that lead to de facto annexation of the West Bank and threaten Israel's future? And the U.S., if the whole world has been fit to be tied over that, and the U.S. said, well, we're giving you all the aid, and you're going ahead and doing it anyway, even though we've been telling you for decades not to pay. You can, I'll use a harsh expression, poison a well for so long, and it's fine. There's no problem, because it's just a little bit, and another little bit, and another little bit. And at some point, the well starts becoming toxic. And we're certainly reaching that point in the last decade. And when I said before that the war postponed but then amplified the crisis, yeah, I think the war, everyone was horrified by October 7th. That gave Israel some goodwill, some breathing space for a while. But then people said, you know, the Palestinian issue, you thought you could put it behind you, you thought you could ignore it. You can't. We've been telling you for something, you can't ignore it. And then, of course, the political discourse, which says that Israel responded totally disproportionately and indiscriminately. I think there's some truth to that, and there's also a lot of exaggeration, a lot of misunderstanding of military affairs. But there's some truth to it. And what we saw, certainly by the summer of 2024 or so, after 3/4 of the year after the war broke out, I think decades of pent-up American fury over Israel's policies towards the Palestinians erupted. And that's when we saw the pressure on Biden, who had to scale back a little bit, even though Biden, his friendship to Israel is unlimited. Okay. Trump is postponing it again. In both cases, it's actually the fact that there's a president who is so pro-Israel that is postponing the moment of reckoning. Eventually, 2.5 years from now, 6.5 years from now, that's going to change. There'll be a president who's at best less friendly and maybe considerably less friendly. Maybe a lot less friendly. So you asked me what's at least the worst case. I mean, the best case, of course, is that the relationship continues as strongly as it was in the past. But the worst case is, I don't think it's France 1967. For those who aren't familiar, France was Israel until 1967, what the U.S. has been since then. And on the turn of a dime after the Six-Day War, abandoned it. Israel still has something of a trauma over that. And people are always worried, when is the U.S. going to do it to us? And the answer is, I don't think that it will ever be quite like France 1967. First of all, the relationship is highly institutionalized today. That could change, but it is highly institutionalized. And there are pillars of support in the U.S. that won't disappear. The Jewish community, the evangelical community, the conservatives at large. And there are people still on the Democratic side as well who are strong supporters of this. So I don't think we'll ever reach that, but even a small change, from my perspective, would be a giant change. And it may not be small.
Your questions, please. Yeah, in the back there. So in recent history or now, what do you view as Israel? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So in recent history or now, what do you view as Israel's largest strategic mistake, excluding fault lines in the U.S. relationship?
Israel's
strategic
mistakes.
Yeah.
How long do we have for this? We've made lots of mistakes over the years. We've also made a lot of right decisions. And I think overall, Israel's national security strategy, given its circumstances, has been a phenomenal success. It starts with the fact that Israel exists after 78 years. In the early years, nobody was convinced that that would be the case. And Israel fought a number of wars, and I think the current one as well, very existential war. And Israel has, while building a totally disproportionate military capabilities, also built a very advanced high-tech society. I was floored a couple of years ago when I looked up Israel's place among American trading partners around the world. There are 200 countries in the world. I thought Israel's probably somewhere in the middle or something. It turns out remember, 10 million people. It's the population and size of New Jersey, population of New York City. It's number 23. Until a year or so ago, Israel was considered the second center of high tech in the world after the U.S. And then China, which has a slightly bigger population, overtook us. So I can live with that. A major cultural center. Israel's done many things very, very right. If you ask me, the biggest mistake preceded the biggest followed the biggest military success, the Six-Day War, which was, it took a year or two afterwards, beginning to settle the West Bank. Now, if I had time, I'd explain where this comes from. It has to do with Jewish history, with Israel's history, but the greatest victory, I think, also sowed the seeds of potential catastrophe if it doesn't find a way out of this situation. So that was the number one biggest mistake. And there have been ongoing mistakes and endless surveillance mistakes with the Palestinians over the decade. If you ask me who was right most of the time, I think the answer overwhelmingly is Israel, but not all of the time. And there were big Israeli mistakes over the years.
Thank you.
There are plenty of others. Yeah, that's what stands out at the moment.
Well, in addition to most people not appreciating and understanding what you said in terms of the history of Israel, they also are subject to such misinformation about its relationship to other countries and what's been going on. And so much of the decisions to not support Israel comes from that thinking. And it just gets to the point where it's the common view of Israel, the distorted view that you were describing before. And Israel seems to take the position over the years, not get into that whole area, not try to go out there because a lot of people already hate us, nothing we can do about it. But do you think Israel should be more aggressive in telling the world and having people in various countries available to really explain the issue what's going on there with a view that over time maybe some of that filtered into the rest of the community.
But there's no doubt that Israel should have done a bigger and better job over the decades of telling the story. But I don't think that's the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that no one, including half of Israel, understands the settlement policy. And once that's the case, and it's been overstated around the world, most of the settlers are nice people like anybody else, and they want peace with the Palestinians as much as anybody else. No one in the world understands that, and half of Israel, more than half of Israel, never supported it either. And once that's the case, how do you then present your overall case to the world? That's been the wedge issue, the issue which has undermined Israel's image. So you have to change the policy if you want to be able to change the discourse. It's not just a matter of PR. Yeah, Israel could have done a better PR job. We can do a better PR job today. It's also really hard when you're a democracy to conduct effective public diplomacy. Look at the United States, which is only slightly less just unpopular than Israel is around the world. Slightly less unpopular. And could the U.S. do a better job of selling its story? Yes. And do I think the president was wrong to dismantle Voice of America, etc.? Yes. But in the end, even when the U.S. had all of those agencies, it was as unpopular as it is now without them. Democracies are these great, raucous, riotous places, and you've got 435 members of Congress who think that they should lead foreign policy, and of course, the president thinks that he has that right. And in Israel, you've got 10 million people think that they have the right to lead Israel's foreign policy. How do you deliver a message to the world when everybody's got a difficult situation?
There's one. Did you have a? No, you're okay. Okay, so over there.
I had a quick question. Thank you, by the way. I've heard in like Christian circles, like especially if you like to watch like Christian Broadcasting Network, the U.S. support of Israel is existential to its own policies, support, and economics. Like, what are your thoughts on like if the U.S. pulls out? In Christian circles, it's believed that if the U.S. supports Israel, the way I've been told is God blesses the United States.
Okay, I think that's mostly among the evangelical population, not only. I'm glad they feel that way. There's no doubt that the sense of religious identification has been one of the primary. It's more than the religious identification. It's an overall cultural affiliation, has been the primary basis for the relationship ever since Israel was founded, and the religious aspect has been a critical part of it. As the United States becomes less religious, then that undermines support.
Yes, please, sir.
Hi, my name is Yash Manuja. I'm a junior in the SFS studying international politics. My question is that the negative PR against Israel, I think it's unprecedented given sort of how common it is to sort of be on your own devices on social media, Instagram, TikTok. If you look at any of the comments, there's a widespread sort of dissociation with the country and a lot of hate. Do you think, my first question is, do you think academic institutions should draw a line somewhere where they should get involved in sort of, do they have an obligation to inform people my age who are susceptible to all of this information online and will subconsciously sort of develop this notion that Israel is not a great actor? Do you think they have you mentioned it, that most people are misinformed or uninformed around the history of Israel. Do you think they have an obligation to get involved? Because I've been in 3 academic institutions throughout my undergraduate years, and it's always sort of me making the effort to opt in. So it's already self-selecting in that sense. So people and future leaders, they might not take an interest in the Middle East, but might unintendedly have to make decisions in high politics. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's the duty of institutions of higher learning, universities, is to teach, not to propaganda, but to teach. I say there's a great regret that I think too many people, especially in the Middle Eastern field, but in political science and other areas as well today. I'm not an expert on this, but I think it's in anthropology and sociology as well. But certainly in Middle Eastern studies, too many professors allow themselves to bring their politics into the classroom and to teach their beliefs, which may or may not accord with reality and generally understood reality. I know I always bend over backwards to try and present the most balanced picture that I can. We're all human beings. But too many people, I think, are just violating. It's like violating, I don't know, is there a Hippocratic oath for professors? There is a onslaught in social media, and you're absolutely right. Qatar funds it. Hamas, at least until not too long ago, were deeply involved and funding. The Iranians fund it. We know with Qatar. The others, I'm convinced, I can't prove it to you, but with Qatar spending fortunes in American institutions, they're not doing it just out of the goodness of their heart. Israel finally woke up to the need to do some more, apropos your question, and the truly paltry sum that was devoted to this kind of public diplomacy has been increased vastly. It's still a joke compared to what the other side is putting into this. But at least it's a step in the right direction. And yeah, I mean, if you're informing yourself, that's great. And I would hope that others do so as much as possible. Because if you have people making decisions, and we do, and the problem will grow worse, making decisions without really understanding where things come from. It's a problem. I ask people, and usually Americans are too polite to tell me what they really think, because I understand that it's sort of a trick question. I would say, how many people think that Israel supplanted a Palestinian state? Came over and took over from a Palestinian state? And a few students will raise their hand. There was never a Palestinian state for 5 seconds. But come and say that in American political discourse today, you will be canceled in seconds. You'll be made a pariah. It happens to be a historical fact. So coming to understand a little bit about the history of this conflict goes a long way. And by the way, I don't conclude from that I'm saying that there should or shouldn't be a Palestinian state. I'm saying the history is important to understand.
Although I think the Palestinian issue has been used by the Arab states as a means of attacking Israel and in a way the United States for a long time. Nevertheless, it probably will have to be solved. Now, you mentioned at the beginning that the Clinton plan of 2000, Olmert of 2008 were good plans and turned down. And then you seemed somewhat negative about any solution. But I wondered, do you have any ideas on what the solution to the Palestinian issue could be in the near or midterm?
Near term, no, I don't think there is any solution for the foreseeable future beyond the near term. I don't know how you define near, but it's not a matter of 5 and probably not 10 years either. I've written a proposal, and if you give me your email after, I'll be happy to send it to you. It would take too long to get into it now. It's, I think, I'll just give you the one sentence. It's a Jordanian-Palestinian confederation, so it's still a 2-state solution, just not an Israeli-Palestinian solution, a Jordanian-Palestinian confederation. It's multilateral land swaps together with the Egyptians to increase Gaza and its size and make Gaza socioeconomically viable, which it is not in its current border. And the way it would be done is Egypt would give land to the Palestinians, Israel would compensate the Egyptians for land, and the Palestinians would agree to allow Israel to annex a equal piece of the West Bank, equal to the territory that they gained in Gaza. And the idea is that both sides gain territory where they really need it, So Israel can annex 80% of the settlers with just a few percent of the West Bank. The Palestinians get a viable Gaza. Nobody gains or loses in that territory. And the third component is the whole thing might begin with an Israeli civil but not military withdrawal from the West Bank. And I think a civil withdrawal, totally unrealistic today, but that might be the first thing, whether in my paradigm or any other, that might 5 to 10 years from now become realistic. And why am I so pessimistic about this? Because if the classic two-state solution, at least many people agree with me, was in its death throes before the war, the fact that the October 7th massacre could happen on Israel's distant, as in 40 miles, Gaza border, and sparsely populated Gaza border, if that could happen on the West Bank border, which literally abuts Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and every major population center, no one in Israel is willing to establish a Palestinian state if that danger can happen. I mean, I think it's going to be many, many years before anyone in Israel will be willing to even think about that. And frankly, you don't have the political leadership on either side. Israel may or may not, following the upcoming elections. The Palestinians are so far away from having a joint leadership with Gaza and a leadership that can make the kinds of concessions they have to make.
I think we have time for just a couple more, and I want to make sure we get students in the back there.
So I was wondering, as a young American myself, I know that the narrative is definitely very pro-Palestine and very anti-Israel, and that's something that's become really entrenched in the past couple of years. How do you think that that narrative can be changed now that it's already like very entrenched in a lot of young Americans' thinking, and how do you think it can be nuanced?
And maybe in the interest of time, we'll just grab maybe two more if that's okay. So,
Wait, so let me just check.
okay, second, here we go. There. Shy's not. Go ahead, please. Yeah.
So when I look at the global dynamics currently in terms of global power politics, I mostly see a culture of pragmatism. I think that in the global situation currently, the attitude towards Israel, both in terms of PR and global anti-Semitism, is extremely bad and needs to be managed. But that being said, I see a lot of grand strategic victories for Israel. I see an Israeli defense sales export business that seems to be extremely attractive, both across Europe and countries like Germany, Greece, Cyprus, others on the top of my head, Asia, including partnerships with India, South America, not only the Abraham Accords, but also the Isaac Accords that are coming out of Argentina. It's an initiative that he's trying to start to boost cooperation between not only Argentina, but other Latin American countries with Israel. And even within Israel itself, investments from companies like NVIDIA to develop facilities in the Negev. So I'm curious, with all of the PR issues aside, are there any strategic victories here for Israel? And sort of what's the silver lining, I guess, in your opinion?
From Mortara,
Thanks. Hi, Deborah Shushan, affiliated here with the CJC, and we've had a chance to exchange views on Twitter in the past when it was still Twitter. So I'm sure you're aware how very unpopular the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran is here in the United States. I would posit that Israel, the U.S.-Israeli relationship, is taking a serious hit from this war, which it is perceived that the U.S. president was brought into by Benjamin Netanyahu against U.S. interests, given that a rationale for this war was never clearly presented to the American people. My question to you is whether U.S. cooperation in this war is worth to Israel the hit that the U.S.-Israeli relationship is taking as a result.
Did you have to ask that question?
I sure did.
That's it.
Okay,
thanks.
So, I mean, how to change the narrative? I think first and foremost, Israel either has to do everything it can to change the reality with the Palestinians, or try and reach a positive outcome. Since I personally don't believe that that's likely for a long time, it at least has to change the narrative and show the American public once again that Israel's the side which the American side always believed is continually pursuing peace. That was the American narrative until the early 2000s. Now, even then, it will take a fair amount of time, because you're absolutely right. This narrative has become pretty deeply entrenched in recent years. There was a second question about the strategic lining. Look, I emphasized before, so let me emphasize again. I think overall, Israel's national security strategy has been a remarkable success. And the fact that Israel is only in third place today as the global center of high tech, and you mentioned the NVIDIA, which is building some mammoth new campus in Israel, huge investment. That's a particularly large example, unusual example, but every American high-tech company has offices and research facilities in Israel, because they know that if you want to come to one place which is far more creative than anywhere else in the world, and so the US and China manufacture more than Israel does, produce more high-tech software or whatever, but the place which has been most creative in this field, or certainly number two after the US, is Israel. And Israel does have diplomatic relations today and has for the last 10, 20 years, more than it ever did in the past. The Abraham Accords happened, and we thought until the war broke out in 2023 that there was going to be imminent normalization with the Saudis, and I think that will happen. And we've seen, by the way, the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrain, and indirectly now even the Qataris are cooperating indirectly with Israel, or directly in some cases, through CENTCOM. So there is a lot to celebrate today. And I think, unlike the early decades, I don't think anybody can destroy Israel anymore. I mean, I think that the era of a literal existential threat is behind us. I say that despite October 7th, as dire as it was. And if Iran goes nuclear, and we have to do everything we can to prevent it, because in principle it is an existential threat, but I think we have ways, both together with the US and without the US, of deterring the Iranians from going that route. So there's a lot to be happy about. Okay, so what is the current war going to do to the bilateral relationship? And I think you're right that there is potential for a hit here, a further hit. I think the argument that Trump was bamboozled by Netanyahu is false. If you remember, just a month and a half ago, Israel was the side which was putting the brakes on and saying to Trump, not so fast. Now, it's not that we're saying we're against this, but we're not prepared for it. We don't think you're prepared for it. I think Israel was right about that. Take your time. Actually, again, not that Netanyahu was against this, but the person leading was Trump, not Netanyahu. Okay, then there's the argument that Netanyahu has been preparing and pushing for this moment for the last 30 years. That's true. He's the prime minister of Israel, and it's his duty to promote Israel's interests. And as much as I disagreed with what he did when coming to Congress at the time, I mean, if there's any issue on which you could go around the president of the United States, it better be one which is existential to Israel's future, and this was that. So I at least give him that credit, even though I think still it was a mistake doing it. I think you're saying that no rationale has been put forward for this war, and if you read the American press, every commentator says that, or at least the liberal one. Commentators say it because they don't want to see the rationale. If you're against it to begin with, then there's no rationale that can be presented that can convince you. I think there is a rationale. Iran isn't yet an imminent nuclear threat. There's still time. That's right. That's true. Should we wait until it has gone nuclear before trying to prevent it? Then it's too late. Clinton waited too long with North Korea. He reached an interim deal in '94. So what happened? By 2000, North Korea was nuclear. Should we play the same thing now with the Iranians? No. That's short-sighted, misguided policy. Will there be a hit? Yes.
Is it worth it?
Is it worth it? Well, it depends what the end game is or what the end outcome is. If it's just another round of many, the answer is probably not. I'm beginning to wonder about the quality of the strategic planning on both sides here, because militarily it's been brilliant so far. Couldn't have been better. Is the objective really to topple the Iranian regime? If that's the case, I don't see how you're doing that. Now, Israel is the US too, but this is the Israeli side of the campaign is systematically trying to take out the IRGC and the Basij and the police headquarters and facilities in every town just about in Iran. That's really a way to weaken the regime. And it could create an opening for the people to come out on the streets. I don't see that happening for quite a while. And I don't see that the US and maybe even Israel have the US the political stomach and Israel maybe the financial stomach to stay the course that way. So if that's really the outcome, then it wasn't worth it.
Chuck, thank you so much. Really so grateful that you've chosen to spend your time here with us in Georgetown. And look forward to a lot of fruitful relationship. Thank you.
I do too. Thank you.